Good morning. I think it's still morning, and thanks also to the organisers for inviting me. I'm going to address this question, how does patient involvement make a difference to clinical research? And perhaps the first thing I need to do is to tell you what I mean by patient involvement in research. And I'm not talking about the patients who are subjects of research, who are participants in the research. I'm talking about when patients become active partners in the research team and are involved in designing and delivering and disseminating the research. And this is the definition that Involve have developed. It's about doing research with patients rather than doing it to them, about them, or for them. So the two questions I'm going to address this morning are, what's the evidence that there's benefits of involving patients in clinical research, but also what are the challenges, and how can we overcome some of those challenges? And I'm drawing on evidence from a literature review that I carried out in 2009, which Ian's already mentioned, which is called the Exploring Impact Report, and it's available on the Involve website, which I've listed on this slide. Involve is an organisation, in case you don't know, that's funded by the Department of Health and promotes and supports involvement in research. And since that time, I've continued to work with them to develop an online bibliography of further evidence that's been published since 2009, and that's also available from the website. So moving on to this question here, what are the benefits for research? Well, as we've heard this morning from our two speakers, it ensures that research is relevant and meaningful to patients. But what I'd also like to present today is the evidence that it improves the quality of research and also benefits researchers. Now, if you look at the evidence that's been published, there is some that suggest there's a benefit to involvement at every stage of research. So you could look at the research cycle, the various stages from identifying topics through to disseminating the results. And there's evidence that there's benefits at all of those stages. But I'm just going to focus on a few case studies of clinical research which illustrate impact at the research design stage, the point of determining the ethical acceptability of the research, the point of recruiting subjects, and how involvement can improve the quality of data collection. So the first case study is an example of a pilot RCT for physiotherapy for people with Parkinson's. So they carried out a small trial with a few people and used the feedback to develop design of the main trial. And some of the things that the patients said were about the kind of practical elements of the trial, but also the conceptual elements of the trial. So some of the things they talked about was the scheduling of appointments, because they said their symptoms changed throughout the day and were also critically dependent on what time they took their medication. So it was going to change from individual to individual. And this is something the researchers hadn't considered, so they built that into the design. And the second thing they talked about were the outcomes for the trial. And what the patients said was that the researchers were too focused on just looking at mobility, the effects on mobility, and that they wanted to look at quality of life issues like their sleeping patterns, their sense of well-being, but also that the researchers were too focused on looking for an improvement. And for people with a long-term condition, degenerative condition like Parkinson's, for them it's just as important not to get any worse. So they wanted the researchers to assess whether the treatment would help them just keep their current level of health and well-being, and that was then built into the trial. The second example was looking at the issues around the ethical concerns around trials. And this was a clinical trial for people affected by stroke. And the treatment had a lot of risks associated with it. So they were looking at its use in a new group of patients, but there was evidence it could benefit some, but also evidence that there was a small risk of a fatal brain hemorrhage in some patients. So that was really a serious ethical concern. There was also an issue because the treatment needed to be given 3 hours after the stroke, and there's an issue around gaining consent at that time. So what the researchers did was to carry out some sort of qualitative research, holding focus groups with patients and carers, and asking them for their views on the trial. And what they found was that people would be willing to take part, they were happy to accept the risks, And they also gave some feedback on useful consent procedures and how they should go about doing that. And the researchers concluded that when they went to go and get their LREC approval for their trial, having had that feedback from the patients greatly facilitated the process. They got through without a problem. It went through very quickly. So it really helped them to kind of find acceptable solutions to the ethical dilemmas they were facing. The third example then is a clinical trial for prostate cancer, the PROTECT trial. And in this trial, there was an arm within it where there was a control arm and the patients weren't receiving any treatment. And when the researchers first started to recruit to the trial, they were only getting about 40% of the men agreeing to take part. And one of the research team members was a qualitative researcher, and they carried out a bit of investigation to see what was happening. Why were the men declining to take part? And what they found out by speaking to men who had refused was there were issues around the way the researchers were describing the trial. So the men didn't really understand the purpose of it and why they were doing it. But there were also issues around the terms the researchers were using. So they were describing this control arm as a watch and wait. And what the men heard when they heard that was that the researchers were watching and waiting for them to die. So no wonder then that they didn't really want to take part. And the feedback they gave to the researchers was that they changed the term. So they used active monitoring as a way of describing that arm, so that men understood they wouldn't just be left, there would be some follow-up. And when they did that and explained the trial better, they got a 70% recruitment rate. There's a lot of evidence around impact of involvement on recruitment. It leads to faster recruitment, it leads to a more diverse sample. You tend to be able to recruit people that probably wouldn't have taken part otherwise. And it seems to be critical when you're trying to do research with hard-to-reach groups. There's a number of reports, for example, research working with gypsies and travellers or with parents who use drugs, that the researchers say at the end, we just simply couldn't have done this research if we hadn't worked with patients or community members to help us understand how to work better with those communities. So it really helps to reach the parts that other researchers can't reach. Fourth example, final example, again is a clinical trial looking into the treatment of Paget's disease. And the researchers here worked very closely with the Paget's Disease Association, and they were involved throughout the development and the delivery of the trial. And it had the same effect on recruitment that we've talked about. There was faster recruitment. But critically, what the researchers said really made a difference was the fact that everyone who took part in the trial completely understood what it was about and why it was important and how it was going to help people with Paget's disease. So they were really committed to it. And so they got a massive response to all of their questionnaires, 99% response rate, which again improves the quality of the data and therefore the usefulness of the research. So that's a few examples that illustrate how involvement can bring a benefit to researchers and to patients and to the research itself. But I just want to move on now to talk about the challenges in getting involvement to happen and how we might overcome them. And one of the biggest challenges is getting researchers and patients around the same table in the first place, I think. Some of the issues are around the kind of attitudes and awareness of the researchers. I mean, naturally, they're trained in a certain way. They often don't have patient involvement as part of their training. They're in an academic culture. They've developed a lot of professional power and expertise. And there can be a sort of question in their mind about how can patients, what can they contribute to the research process? So there needs to be some training and support for researchers to help them recognise the value of the patient contribution. And some people have talked about the importance of the evidence that I've described and how valuable that would be to convince the skeptics. But I think I'm not sure that's the only answer. It's because involvement is often a very subjective experience. And it's very different to read a journal article that reports that patient involvement helped improve the cultural sensitivity of our questionnaire, for example. It's often reported in that way. It's a very different thing to sit down with a patient who says to you, you can't go into, or if the example I'm thinking of is the gypsy traveller community, who said, you can't go into my community and ask that question, they'll chuck you out. You can't, that's simply not allowed to happen. So that's a very kind of experiential thing. It's a sort of light bulb moment when you realise that you understand another person's perspective and you've got to change what you're doing. And it's very hard to capture that in the traditional evidence-based way. So I think there's an argument for encouraging researchers to try it and do it for themselves. Because I've heard a lot of researchers say to me, well, I had to do this because my funders required it, and now I've done it, I get it, and I wouldn't do it any other way. I wouldn't do my research any other way. So I think there's an argument for combining a carrot and stick approach, encouraging researchers to do it, as well as telling them about the evidence of the benefits, and supporting and training them to deliver it well. So the other kind of main challenge then, I think, is skilling up the researchers and the patients to deliver more effective involvement. And in the same way, the patients may need some awareness raising of how their contribution can bring value. I've worked with some patients who've done this amazing, sophisticated analysis of a research proposal, but at the end said to me, oh, well, I'm not sure I've got anything to contribute to research. And they need some kind of training to understand how their perspective and their knowledge and experience adds value to the research process. So they may need something also about how research works so they can understand where and when to offer their contribution to bring the most added value. And similarly, researchers need training in how to do it. They may need new skills like facilitating skills, chairing skills, managing a meeting where you've got a mix of professionals, the kind of challenges that Sally's already talked about. And providing them with that kind of training will mean that they'll deliver more effective involvement. And then I think the final issue, getting more sort of strategic about involvement, is to think about how can we match people's skills and experience to the tasks involved. And as I've said, there's evidence that patients can bring benefits at all the different stages of research, and we need to think about what skills and experience are best suited for different roles. If you're going to have someone on your trial steering committee, for example, what kind of skills and experience are valuable in that context, which might be different to the skills and experience that are going to be valuable when people are commenting on patient information sheets. And the same is true of researchers. And perhaps we need to start thinking about multidisciplinary research teams where we're bringing researchers and patients together and recognising what skills and experience they can contribute to the whole team. Final slide, final example. This is a picture of the space shuttle, which used to be NASA's laboratory in space before the International Space Station was completed. And what used to happen was there was a team of scientists on the ground who used to devise the experiments that were carried out on board. But the scientists didn't go up in the shuttle. It was the astronauts. And the astronauts were often the subjects of the research, but also had to do the research on themselves. And when it first started, it just didn't work. The research failed a lot of the time, and NASA was wasting millions of dollars. So they came up with a genius idea. Well, we'll get the astronauts and the scientists to work together. And astronauts use their knowledge and experience of what it's like on the shuttle to improve the research design. And it worked. And that's how they did all their projects after that stage. So I think it's a nice example. It illustrates very neatly another benefit of involvement, which is that it can stop you wasting money on research that doesn't work. And I think that's a really important lesson for funders and pharmaceutical companies spending a lot of money on clinical trials. So an important benefit of involvement. Okay, thank you.